It's great to be with you this morning. If you want to open your Bibles to Acts chapter 27 this morning, we're going to get through chapter 27 and the first 10 verses of chapter 28. And as you're opening your Bibles to Acts 27, I think one of the basic longings that we as humans have is to be invested in. And what does it mean for us to experience investment? And just to continue what Angel was saying in the space of Mother's Day, that we are so pleased and thankful for the women in this church who are big sisters and aunts and mothers and grandmothers in this spiritual family, who are choosing to spend their life investing in the men and women of our church. And so I want to continue to encourage you to be that presence in the lives of others, and to think through, what does it mean for you to be a woman who invests in others with the beauty and the kindness and the sincerity and the joy of Jesus? And so that is another thing for us to be thinking through. If you're taking notes this morning, the title of this week's message is Light Breaks Through Darkness, and you will see how this is going to take shape. Also, I'm pretty confident that there's not a lot of sailing experience here this morning, and so I don't know what your experience is on the high seas, but we are going to be involved in Luke sharing the story of Paul on a ship that ultimately leads to a shipwreck, and chapter 27 is filled with nautical imagery and terminology and understanding, and so I hope that you don't find yourself lost in the detail. And at the same time, if chapter 27 was a movie, this would be one of the most exciting parts of the movie. It is a big storm and a crew wondering what to do and trying to save the ship, and Paul speaking into that moment. And so I would encourage you, as I have encouraged you every week, to let Luke draw you into the story that he's telling as he is speaking of the movement of the church and the growth of the church and the establishment of the church, as well as how Paul is on his way now to Rome, where Jesus himself has promised that he will end up. And so that is where we are. So with that, I am going to read chapter 27, and then we'll move forward with chapter 28 in a little bit. When it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. When we had boarded a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Just again, kind of to point you in a direction to be aware. Notice the usage of us. Luke is again with Paul. So Paul is allowed to have some people with him that are sailing to Rome, and Luke is part of the group that is with him. Verse 3, the next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. When we had put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After sailing through the open sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. Sailing slowly for many days, with difficulty, we arrived at Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete, off Salmone. With still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous, since the Day of Atonement was already over. Paul gave his advice and told them, "Men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. When a gentle south wind sprang up, They thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed the anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. Since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Again, in verse 15, that's just a sign of first century ships and sailing. With modern sailing and modern ships, and maybe a movie that you've seen that one of the safe ways to keep a sailboat is to head directly into the wind. But this is saying that the ship was unable to head directly into the wind. So they just let the wind carry the boat wherever it was going to be carried. So there's a lot of chaos happening here. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. After hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing they would run around on the Syrtis. They lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night, an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar, and indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island.' When the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight, the sailors thought they were approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed a little farther and sounded again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. Then, fearing we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come." Again, they're trying to slow down the ship as they're approaching what they believe to be rocks. It's getting shallower and shallower and shallower. And when you look, there's been lots of historical data that's brought up that ships would throw as many as 10 anchors overboard to slow down the ship. And so Paul is saying, we threw one and we started to slow down. And then we threw another and we started to slow down. And they would cut the anchors and throw another one and start to slow down. So this is all part of just ancient shipping practices. And we're all super clear on what that's about. Verse 30, some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head." After he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them, and after he broke it, he began to eat. They all were encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. And we'll continue in chapter 28 in a moment. Again, if you're in the movie, if you're watching Master and Commander or some other kind of nautical, wonderful ship movie, you are in the story. The ship is being tossed all over the place. The crew is going crazy. They're trying to survive. Paul is giving instruction. People aren't believing what Paul is saying. Like, all of this stuff is happening. But what you need to know before you ever begin chapter 27 is you need to know some background information. And the first background piece of information that you need to be aware of is this: the Jews, the Israelites, were not a sea people. They were a people that enjoyed the land. In fact, Egyptians and Phoenicians and the Greeks, they were the sea voyaging type. You don't hear of Jews taking on the Mediterranean. That just wasn't part of their identity, wasn't part of their culture. Yeah, Poseidon, and for Rome, Neptune was a big deal. And so there were many of the Egyptians and Phoenicians and Greeks that would conquer the seas. But for the Jews, the sea was known as a monster. And it was seen and it was interpreted as a dark force. And so when you look at the stories that the people of Israel tell, you notice that the sea is a representation of evil, of the unknown, of dark forces. That's why in the Exodus, God, Yahweh, is talked about in the command and in the power of what? Parting the sea. As the Israelites were approaching the sea and the Egyptians were pursuing them, it is through the power of God, through the kindness of Yahweh, that the sea is parted and the Israelites are able to move through. If you read Daniel, and Daniel is a strange book about prophecy, what you notice is the wicked world of empires and monsters come up out of the sea in Daniel chapter 7, verse 3. The sea was unknown. The sea was dangerous. The sea was a dark place. And you have to know that in order to understand what is Luke trying to communicate to us as the reader, as the audience. Also, we like to know where we are. So the map is on the screen. You know that Paul has been in Caesarea. And so in first century cargo shipping, they tried to stay as close to the coast as possible. You were safer the closer you were to the coast. And so they have left Caesarea and then they moved to Sidon. And in verse 3, it says that the centurion, the person, the Roman guard that was in charge of Paul, showed kindness to Paul and actually allowed Paul to leave the ship and be cared for by other believers in Sidon. And so you see just even how God is caring for Paul on his journey, because he's promised that Paul will end up in Rome. So they get there, they go around the island of Cyprus. We are familiar with that. We've been walking through Acts the whole time. We know Cyprus. We know that the very first missionary journey was there. So Paul has rounded Cyprus, and then it goes, hugs the shore, heads south, and is now in Fair Havens. You also notice the distance between Fair Havens and Phoenix. It's not very far, but you start to get the details of the stories we begin to read through the passage. When you read verses 1 through 8, it has every evidence of, once again, all the details of a travelogue. Luke is with Paul. Luke is a detailed person. Luke wants to describe and talk about the departures and the arrivals and the weather conditions. And he probably logged what food they ate and how it settled and the adventures that they were on. This is just who Luke was. And so you read this like a newspaper. And then on that day, we left from Caesarea and we arrived in Sidon. And the centurion was such a nice guy. He let Paul go visit the other brothers and sisters. And we had a great time with other Christians on this place. Like, it's just this type of information that's being recorded that we can take part in the story. I already mentioned that Julius the centurion had treated Paul kindly. That's also a bit of foreshadowing of what to expect in the future of the story. Again, I say it again and again and again because it's important to have this in your mind as you feel the details of the ship's journey. The people of Israel were not a seafaring people. They were not. The sea was used in all forms in the storytelling of Israel to represent danger and the unknown, judgment and chaos. That's the backdrop. You have to know that to understand how Luke is going to tell the story about Paul's involvement journeying to Rome. We now find ourselves at verses 9 and 10. And this is really exciting. The map kind of showed you, hopefully it was a reminder of who Paul is. For Paul being a Jew, for Paul being a Pharisee, since Paul has met Jesus on the road to Damascus. And remember, Luke has spent all this time describing Paul's conversion. Paul has been traveling. Paul has logged a lot of miles. His travel visa, he can get free flights wherever he wants to go. This is a man who has built up a lot of miles. And so for a Jew, he's actually a pretty experienced man of the sea. He has literally spent thousands of miles on a ship. He has experience. He has experience and knowledge of how a crew operates, how a ship is supposed to navigate the waters, what weather conditions are like. And so it's not just out of nowhere, but in verses 9 through 10, Paul speaks words of caution to the centurion, to Julius, who had shown him kindness. And he basically says, hey, it's that time of year when it's not the wisest to travel by sea. But the centurion doesn't listen to Paul because, after all, Paul's a Jew. What does Paul know about the sea? He listens to the captain of the boat, who is actually also the owner of the ship. So the centurion just is like, I think the captain knows better than you, Paul. But we're given some details about why Paul gives the warning. And we're told that the Day of Atonement was already over. What that does is Luke tells us the time of year that it is. And again, according to the lunar calendar for this moment in time, a lot of scholars have spent a lot of time trying to date when this voyage took place. And most have given a really reasonable approximation that this would have been in AD 59. So if those of you that like precise dates, that's where we are in history, in 59. And the Day of Atonement would have taken place on October 5th in the year of AD 59. So we're right in that beginning of fall, headed towards winter. And this is why this is important. Winter is close, and sailing in the Eastern Mediterranean started to get dangerous in mid-September. And in fact, sailing would definitely stop altogether by mid-November. So Paul knows the weather. He knows the time of year. He knows when it's dangerous to sail and when it's not dangerous to sail. And so Paul's advice is, let's stay in Fair Haven. This is where we should go. But the captain says, nope, we don't want to winter in this really small place. We want to move to another harbor, which is super close. Remember, I asked you to make sure you noticed how close it was. The harbor of Phoenix on Crete, facing the southwest and the northwest, and to winter there. So now there's another map. So they're in Fair Havens. Paul wants to stay in Fair Havens. And the captain's like, no, let's just head just briefly north so that we can have a better port, so that we can be in a better location. We will winter there. In all reasonableness, look at the map. You're like, this guy's experienced. He's been on the Mediterranean a lot. He can probably make his way just a little north. This is where we find ourselves in verses 13 through 20. I want you to keep the map up for just a second because I'm going to talk about it in just a second. But unrelenting weather conditions happen, and maritime survival tactics take place. Notice verse 13. When a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose because they're headed north. So they're excited that the wind is coming from the south. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. And since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, you see it there. So instead of headed north because of this crazy wind that came, it pushed them south of Cauda, and now they're in no man's land. They were barely able to get control of the skiff, which again, for 14 days and nights, the ship is in the grip of what is described as a northeastern. And we're like, I don't know what that is. It's a hurricane. That's what's happening. The weather has moved to a hurricane, and now they're in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and they have lost complete control of the ship. And so for 14 days and 14 nights, they're just in the middle of the sea. That is the description of what is happening to Paul and the crew and everyone that's involved on the ship. As we move from verses 13 through 20, we then now find ourselves at verse 21. And I just don't know how else to read verse 21. It seems so interesting and odd. The only thing is that I can give grace to Paul and know that Paul has a heart for people. He's caring for people. He's also a leader. He also has experience. And so in the best tone of voice that I know how to muster, verse 21, they had been without food for a long time. Paul then stands up in the middle of the storm and the chaos and says, "You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss." Like, I don't know. I mean, I told you so, nanny, nanny, boo, boo. I mean, I just don't know. Like, I don't know how Paul speaks about this. I don't know how he gathered the audience, but anyone would know that if you're in the middle of a heavy storm and you're trying to not lose your life, you probably don't appreciate Paul saying this. But verse 22, "I have urged you to take courage." And then they probably tuned in because Paul says something that seems outrageous. "I urge you to take courage because I have been told there will be no loss of any of your lives, but we are going to lose the ship." This is this kind of extraordinary thing that Paul speaks up. "I tried to warn you. I tried to let you know, but," and then Paul says, "I was visited by an angel from the God of whom I serve. And he told me that everyone will be safe. We're going to lose the ship, but everyone will be safe." Now, part of you may wonder, okay, it's this time of year. Why was the captain so determined to make it to another place? During the off season of sailing, Rome highly incentivized captains of ships, especially cargo ships, to make the dangerous journey from the east, from Egypt and the grain and everything that was coming from there, to supply Rome with supplies. Remember, Rome was growing. It was overpopulated. It had utilized its own resources. It needed resources, not just in the spring and summer and fall, but it needed resources in the winter. And so captains were paid boatloads of money, no pun intended, to get cargo to places even when the time of year was unsafe. And so the captain gambles, but Paul says, actually, you're going to lose the ship. You're going to lose everything on board, but you're not going to lose the life of the people that are on board. So he tries to warn them, but something is happening here. If you are a Jewish reader, there's a storm. There's a person on board. There's a whole crew panicking that the storm is causing chaos. And as you think about what does the sea represent and what's the background, and you're thinking about the stories that have been told of the Jews and of Israelites, there's another seafaring individual that you think about from the Old Testament that was on a ship in the middle of the storm and that chaos began to ensue. And the person is Jonah. But Paul is literally, in this story, the anti-Jonah. You see, Paul's not going to be thrown overboard. He's actually not running from what God has asked him to do. Paul is being faithful to what God has asked him to do. You see, Jonah was running. The crew saw that it was Jonah's fault that the people were about to die. So they throw Jonah overboard. But Paul is doing what God asked him to do. And Paul says, we are going to lose the ship, but no lives are going to be lost. We're going to safely arrive in Rome. And no one here is going to perish. That's what is described in verses 21 through 26. We then get to verses 27 through 32. And even if there's conversations, and even if there's take courage, and even if there's anger and disappointment, and what are we doing, and fear, and all of these things, in verses 27 through 32, the conditions of the sea, they're not improving. The storm is still raging. And so some sailors are attempting to then save themselves. They look for basically what is a lifeboat, but Paul warns the centurion, so the centurion and the other soldiers aboard listen to Paul this time, and then they prevent those sailors from escaping because they've been told that everyone needs to stay on board so that everyone's lives will be saved. Again, notice the subtleties. Luke starts with the centurion being kind but not listening to Paul, and now the centurion is starting to listen to Paul. You see an arc of the story being told. As a Gentile reader, so we've talked about that Paul would be seen as the anti-Jonah, but now as a Gentile reader, someone who doesn't have a Jewish background, when you're reading the story of Luke, if you're reading the headlines of the newspaper, what would you have observed? What conclusions would you come to if you had read Acts 27 and Acts 28? Well, the first is this. As you're reading the story, you suddenly realize because an angel has visited Paul and has promised Paul that God is going to save every life on the ship, that what? God is on Paul's side. That something bigger than the crew is going to help in the safety of the voyage. What you also learn is Gentiles who have a specific worldview understand that Paul is innocent of any crimes. We've seen this over and over again. We talked about this last week. We talked about this the week before, that one of the things that Luke is highlighting is Paul is innocent. And everyone involved realizes that Paul's innocent, but they just don't want him around. And so you would see this as you read Acts 27. And the reason you would see this is because the belief and the worldview of the Gentiles was that the gods punished the wicked. And so the trouble at sea was no accident. And so you would start to see these things happening. This is where Jonah, the story comes in. Remember, something wasn't right. And so the sailors needed to get rid of what wasn't right. And for Jonah, it was him. He wasn't right. So throw him overboard. But notice we all of a sudden now have tension. What we've been told over and over and over again is Paul's innocent. But now there is a storm at sea that is threatening the lives of everyone. And so why is the storm raging even though Paul is innocent, which is then the next thing the Gentile reader would make the connection. You see, the fact of the matter is sometimes the innocent get hurt. And sometimes the innocent get hurt because they're around the guilty. So for instance, Jonah was guilty, and the crew was suffering because it was the guilt of Jonah. And in this case, they may be thinking, oh, wait, Paul's innocent, but someone else on board isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. This is just how people tried to make sense of their world. We now find ourselves at verses 33 through 38. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing." Again, there are no stars at night. It's just all clouds. It is raining. It is stormy. The boat has just been wandering and has been tossed. And you can just imagine how tired they are. Maybe they haven't eaten because they're just seasick. Even though they're seasoned, the waves have not been happy. There's all kinds of reasons. They are working tirelessly to save their lives. They haven't had time to eat. But in this moment, something happens where Paul is able to gather their attention and say, hey, we need to gain some energy because the next moments are going to be pretty rough. And so the entire crew pauses to eat. And verse 34, so I urge you to take some food. For this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head. After he said these things, he had taken some bread. He gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat. They were all encouraged and took food themselves. I mean, they were hangry. And so when they ate, they were encouraged. And this isn't communion. This is not what this is. This is just Paul distributing bread and praying to his God in front of a captured audience and trusting that God is going to do what God has promised to do. This is what is happening. He thanks God. The crew is encouraged. Then verses 39 through 41. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could, after cutting loose the anchors. They left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship in the ground. Again, more nautical know-how. How do we make sure that we can survive this shipwreck? Everything is happening. But what they see in the distance is a bay and a beach. And so all focus and energy is given to getting the ship ashore. But we pause once again and we have to ask ourselves the question, what imagery is Luke wanting us to grab a hold of? And the story is bursting with imagery. The first is this: the good news of Jesus is taking on the cosmic force of evil. Paul, an apostle, is in the depths and the chaos of the sea. Remember, you got to have that background information. The sea is a dark place. The sea is chaotic. The sea is evil. But Jesus is helping Paul in the middle of that evil overcome the sea. Also, remember, the flesh and the world and the enemy do whatever they can to distract Jesus followers. And right here, we have the flesh of people trying to save themselves. And we have the world, just the chaos of the ocean, trying to destroy what Paul is doing. And we have the real enemy, the evil one, who's also trying to distract. And they're all trying to do their best to distract Paul from getting to Rome. There's real struggle ahead for those who in obedience faithfully pursue Jesus. I mean, I think people still believe this lie, but hopefully we at Second Mile will start to not listen to this lie. But this is what the lie says. The lie says, if you commit your life to Jesus, life will get easier. That's just a lie. It's not true. If you commit your life to Jesus, what imagery comes up is this: there is still real struggle for those who are in obedience, who faithfully pursue Jesus. there still may be a shipwreck in your future. There still may be turmoil. There still may be loss. There absolutely will be grief. You see, the promise that God gives us is that if we give our lives to Christ, what he grows in the depths of our soul is a hope in the promises of God. And what God has promised is that he is in process of restoring all things, of making things new. And so we can hold on to the chaos of life because all of the promises of God are yes in Jesus. That's the promise. And so how do we cling to that promise? Verses 42 through 44. There is panic. The ship has run aground. What are we going to do? And as there's panic and this what now is hovering over everybody, the prisoners, the soldiers, the crew, the captain, everything that's happening, what you notice once again is in the centurion, he shows wise leadership. You see, humans do what humans do. And in the middle of the most chaotic moment of the ship running into ground, self-preservation is a powerful force. And we're told in verse 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plans because he wanted to save Paul. Notice the progression again of centurion. Didn't listen to Paul, listened to Paul. Now he's saving Paul's life. There's a movement happening here. And with that, when you think through this, it's like in the middle of all this chaos, how is it that the Roman soldiers would so easily turn and kill those who are categorized as prisoners on the ship? I mean, this just seems like such a crazy, bizarre, chaotic space that everyone is about to jump ship. And what's coming across the Romans soldiers' minds is self-preservation. They need to destroy the prisoners. Why is that? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. It's because that's what Roman soldiers do. And if you begin to think through just this time in history, the training that the soldiers of Rome went under, that is how the system worked. Roman soldiers weren't allowed to use common sense. They weren't allowed to be led by goodwill. Roman soldiers were taught, you show your loyalty or you risk death itself. You remember the jailer in Acts when Peter is in prison, and then everything is shaken, and they are let go from their shackles, and the jailer's about to kill himself, and Peter shouts out, "Hey, wait, don't do that." It's because Roman soldiers knew that if they didn't carry out their task, that they themselves would be killed. And so even in the chaos of a shipwreck, this is what's happening. Rome hadn't become Rome by becoming soft. But what we've learned in the subtle details is that the centurion had observed and begun to understand that Paul was no ordinary prisoner. And so something was causing pause to the standard mode of operation for Roman soldiers. And so the centurion gives orders to leave the prisoners alone. And all 276 safely reached the shore. N.T. Wright describes this whole process through the narrative of Scripture in this way: through the waters to safety. That's the Noah story, the Exodus story, the John the Baptist story, the Jesus story, the Paul story, our story. Through the waters to safety. It is the image of the gospel that Jesus is renewing all things. We then get to chapter 28. And we're going to look at the first 10 verses. As we see this, once safely ashore, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in since it was raining and cold. As Paul gathered a bundle of brushwood and put it on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the local people saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man no doubt is a murderer. Even though he has escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But he took the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm. They expected that he would begin to swell up or suddenly drop dead. After they waited a long time and saw nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now in the area around that place was an estate belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius' father was in bed suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went to him and praying and laying his hands on him, he healed him. After this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. They arrive on the island of Malta, and the local people, all that's told about the local people is that they are extremely hospitable. They are extraordinarily kind. And so Paul, even in this and in his fatigue and in his getting ashore and in his age and in all the things, he's actually gathering firewood for the crew as well. But once again, we need some background info. In the same way that the sea represents something, guess what? The snake was certainly a classic symbol of evil. Of course, we have the snake in the Garden of Eden. We have Moses who lifts up the serpent in the wilderness in Numbers chapter 21, verse 9. And in verses 3 through 6, we're given a description again of local beliefs, local customs, local worldview. We have, reading the newspaper that Luke is writing, snake, poison, justice. Like, think about it. This is the picture that Luke is writing. There's a snake, and it's a poisonous snake, and justice is coming. What's going to happen to Paul? Like, this is what's happening. And so Paul is serving the group. He's gathering wood. He's bitten by a snake. And he's not just bitten by the snake, but the snake is attached. It's just like, here's Paul, here's the snake. And the crowd, the locals are like, oh my goodness, this guy is certainly going to die. And the universe has judged him. But what happens? He survives. You see, their thought is he just survived this unbelievable shipwreck and then he's going to die by a snake bite. The gods have judged him. But Paul doesn't die. In fact, nothing happens to Paul. And as a result, the locals are now having their worldview challenged just from this simple presence of Paul. Side note, just for current days, Malta has a vibrant and ancient culture. And today, the island boasts of no snakes. I don't know why, but there's no snakes there. And the beach that they have is called St. Paul's Bay. So anyone want to go? I do. Let's go. Let's go to St. Paul's Bay. Verses 7 through 10, we're then introduced to a new character, Publius. He's a leading man of the island. In mission circles, when you start to talk about how do you engage in a people across the world, often men and women within those people groups that you're trying to engage, when someone is open to hospitality, they're open to relationship with a foreigner, they just have literally a peace about them. We often refer to them as a man or woman of peace, and Publius is an example of being a man of peace. He welcomes everyone. He entertains them. He invites them into their home. And what Paul does is Paul is then used to bring healing to Publius' father, as well as many others who are sick. And Ben Witherington III, another scholar, in his commentary says that Malta fever was a real thing. And in the 19th century, now this is several thousand years later, In the 19th century, Malta fever was discovered to be transmitted by drinking goat's milk. So it's very likely that the islanders were just dealing with a sickness, with dysentery that was coming from the consumption of goat's milk. But I want you to notice, as Paul serves this very kind, hospitable people, Luke doesn't mention anyone becoming a follower of Jesus. You see, both the sea and the snake have tried to get rid of Paul, and both haven't succeeded. And the message of Jesus as the risen Messiah is going to continue because the restoration of all things is in process. And the powers of evil cannot stop it. The flesh, the world, the evil one. And Paul is going to arrive in Rome, and perhaps he has suffered along the way, and perhaps his case of jet lag is way worse than anything that we have experienced. But Paul will get to where God has promised him because the gospel is continuing to spread. One of the things that I want you to notice is that Paul just interacts filled with the Holy Spirit with the people that he comes in contact with. You see, what I encourage you to do this week is to read Luke chapter 23, because Luke is actually intentionally overlaying the narrative of Jesus' journey to the cross and the narrative of Paul's journey to the Rome. And you're gonna see this interplay. And Luke wants you, he's the author of both Luke and Acts, and he wants you to see what was Jesus' journey to the cross and what is Paul's journey to Rome. And the reason he wants you to look at this, because he wants to be resonating at the depths of your soul this question. What exactly does it mean for a follower of Jesus to take up his cross? You see, that's the question that I want you to be left with. Paul would interact with the people of Malta. And he interacted with them with sincerity and kindness and presence. His objective in Malta was not missionary preaching. Paul was in Malta as a result of a shipwreck, not because he was on an evangelism journey. But he just met the people with kindness and sincerity and presence. He was aware of what was going on around him, and the Holy Spirit prompted him to engage the people. What I want you to be left with this morning, very simply, is in your everyday life, do you interact with others with sincerity, with kindness, and with presence? And when I say presence, I mean, do you interact with others without distraction? Not because it's your goal to evangelize. Now, I pray that you talk about Jesus all the time. But when you live your everyday life, are the people that you're coming in contact with, are they noticing that you are kind? Are they noticing that you're sincere? Are they noticing that when you engage with them, you're not distracted? You're present. You're listening. You're asking questions. You're not distracted. They have your fully captured attention. You see, I think it's in that space that you can begin to then ask yourself the next question. How can you show the peace of the Holy Spirit through normal, ongoing relationships? Take Julius the centurion just for a moment. Paul didn't give Julius the plan of salvation, but Paul lived his life in the most chaotic space of a shipwreck. And what Julius noticed was Paul's kindness, his sincerity, and his presence. My prayer is that we would be that kind of people. And in the same way, the centurion's thoughts and mind began to change concerning Paul, that those that we interact with would begin to change their opinion about Jesus, the Savior of the world.